like with strings, very often we want to traverse all of the elements or many of the elements of an array, and that's going to require a loop because a lot of time we won't know how many there are, or maybe we just don't feel like writing a million lines of code to access a million different values. So I've got a couple examples here for you. Here I'm just generating a random number somewhere between 15 and 20, and then using that to create an array of ints of that length. So we don't really know how many numbers are in this array, but somewhere between 15 and 20. And then what I'd like to do is I'd like to put in a random number to every index of the array. Well, even though I don't know how many values there are, I did learn previously that the array indexes will run from 0 up to and including length minus 1. So if I properly structure my loop to start at index 0 and end at length minus 1, counting by ones, I should be able to access every single index that belongs to any array by the name of nums. And then what I've done here is I've used the fact that I can modify particular values of the nums array as long as I specify which index, and I'm putting a random number in there. Notice that my loop variable here is serving as that index. So by starting at 0, the first index of the array, I gained access to that value, and every successive value after that, all the way up to the last valid index, minus 1. And then I could use pretty much the exact same loop in connection with some print statements here. So here, I'm going to print out every value that gets randomly produced. And I'm doing the same thing here. I actually ran this loop backwards. So what we'll see on this one is whatever number originally gets printed last will now get printed first. I started this loop at the last index, and I worked my way back to 0 by subtracting 1 each time. So you'll definitely want to use these loops again. So you might just want to note how I did it here or create your own way of doing it. But this is a loop that we're going to write over and over and over. All right. And so let's see what happens as we try these basic loop traversals out. So I didn't really know what numbers I was going to get. They were all randomly generated. And in fact, I didn't know how many numbers I was going to get, but it's somewhere between 15 and 20 count. Okay. And all of the numbers range between 0 and 9. And you'll notice that that first list that I've highlighted, see how it ended like 9, 3, 4, 8. And looking here, 8, 4, 3, 9. So now that backwards print is starting. This one started with 6, 7, 8. This one finished with 8, 7, 6. So it really was a reversal of the contents of that array. So if you needed to reverse an array, this loop could easily do that for you. It's important to note that as we write these loops here, my loop was not like actually getting values from the array or producing values. My loop was producing the indexes that belonged to the array. And then I used those indexes as access points to the array. Here I did it to modify the values, and here I did it to access and retrieve the values. Okay? We could use it in either role. Here I'm doing kind of both of those things at once. So, uh, like I said here, it's important to note that your loop is producing the indexes. Okay. So I've got a string array now. It's got 5 states in it. I called it states. And the first time up, I'm just going to loop through and I'm going to take the state found at the index. So starting at 0, in this case, Michigan, and I'm going to replace it. So I'm going to reassign this particular entry of the array. Here I retrieved that same state, Michigan. And since it's a string, I can apply any string method to it. Okay, whatever comes out of that array has a type. In this case, the type is string. So whatever you retrieve from the state's array could then be treated as any other string. Length, substring, index of, char at, whatever you've learned previously. Okay? So here I've got a 2-letter substring. In this case, it'd be MI. And that would now become the new value for that array. Okay, California got dropped to CA and so on. We can do this with while loops as well. So, if you want to use a while loop, really no different. Notice that I just kind of moved my starting expression out prior to the loop. I put my step expression at the end of the loop, and then I wrote my control expression right here. And I changed the control a little bit, but it doesn't matter. I just took out the equals case, so I bumped up one more to allow me to reach the end of that string. You got to find what works for you. Okay. And then I'm just printing the states. And notice that as I printed those states, they all came out as 2-letter strings now. So I had permanently changed the array by assigning back onto those index values. I actually changed the contents of the array. Now it holds on to those 2-letter strings. So when I retrieve those here, that's what I got. Like we learned with strings and loops, we've got to be very careful of off by one errors. So you don't want your loop to start too late or end too soon or run too far to the right or run too far to the left. Potentially you could miss values. Potentially you could get an index out of bounds exception. So just like we saw with strings, we have to be very careful with how we structure our loop. So here's an example of where we might, run into some trouble with this. I've got a problem here called equal adjacent. And we're going to try to write this method. This method returns a Boolean, and then we're going to print the Boolean here. So here's how we're going to write the method. It says write a Boolean return method equal adjacent that returns true if the parameter array vals, okay, so that's the values array here getting passed in, contains at least one adjacent pair of values that are equal, false otherwise. We're going to send over that nums array that I created at the start of the problem. We'll have to traverse through it and look for a pair of equal values. Looking through this particular array, which again is random, this array would have returned true because you can see right there, there's some sixes. There's actually 3 in a row. We only need to see 2 in a row. If we run it again, it might randomly generate an array with a pair of values. It might not. This particular array would have also returned true. It had consecutive zeros. But in another array that we look at, we might not see a consecutive pair. Okay, so how would we do that? Well, there's obviously more than one way, but if we just started with that same loop structure that I showed you a minute ago, it might not be ideal. Let's see where this is going to take us. So if I run this all the way up to vals.length -1, that's the last valid index, and I go with I++. And now if I'm checking for a consecutive pair, I might say something like if vals, found at index I equals vals found at index, and here I could go either one to the left or one to the right. So if you did I+1, then you got to be a little careful. This might go too far to the right. Or if you had done, say, I-1, well, now you might go a little too far to the left. But you can kind of see the dilemma here, perhaps, as to what might happen. But if I do find this, I'll say return true. Okay. And as we start doing more of these logic problems, again, a common mistake that I see students want to do is like they always want to put an else on everything. This would actually be really, really bad. Okay. So what I'm writing right here is actually going to destroy all of my code because this is not going to run the loop all the way through. This what this would do, this would look at the 4 and the 0. And it would say that they don't equal each other, and then it would say else return false. And remember, once you return, the method shuts down. So this would say false. It would not go on to look at the rest of the numbers. It would quit running the loop. It would quit running the method. And it would fail to notice that those zeros there were successive. So I absolutely do not want to say else return false. I don't want to even consider returning false until I've reached the end of this process, and now I could go ahead and return false. Remember, another way you could do this, okay, to avoid an error like that is you could make this into more of a counter situation where if you do find perhaps a match, you go ahead and count that match. And then later, you would return, because we have to turn this into a Boolean now. As long as that count went past 0, then you must have found a match at some point in the process. Okay, that's a good idea as well. Now, however, right now I'm going to get an index out of bounds exception. So this is what we're talking about, the off by 1 error. Let's see how we get this index out of bounds exception. Okay, so right here, index out of bounds, like I expected it to, okay? And that's because right here, I allowed my loop to access the last valid index. In other words, like for this example, that would have been the 5. And the problem is if you let I take you to that last number, and then you say, oh, let's compare it to the next one, there is no next one. So I can't allow this to go that far into the array. So here, I would have wanted this array to have stopped one index sooner than it did, okay, to keep me in bounds, right? Or if, if putting that -2 there, doesn't make as much sense to you, okay, you could leave it at 1. We could start the loop at 1 and then do a right to left comparison this way. Like, so now I'm saying let's compare I to I minus 1. And so I'll start it at 1 so that originally this takes index 0, or in other words, the first value of the array. And then that would work as well. Now you'll notice here that I got false. So that means that there can't be a consecutive pair. And yeah, I don't see one. Okay. See how there's no consecutive pairs? If you run this a few times, you should probably get true a couple times, false a couple times. It happens occasionally. Okay. So here, this time I got true, and sure, right enough. See, there's 2 5s, there's 2 6s, there's 2 0s. So this one had 2 8s. This one actually had 4. Only needed to find one. But by finding that one, it was able to return true. So again, you got a few ways to do it. Just make sure you're not like being kind of careless with like an else statement here. All right. And by the way, so there's some more practice hits to consider. Okay. And then the array 2 section in Java back. You probably want to skip the last couple rows. They get pretty tough, but you definitely want to practice writing some code here.